The morning I opened the workshop door and saw what lay on the sawdust floor, my knees nearly gave out beneath me. I had to grip the frame of that old barn door, the one my father had hung in 1962, just to keep myself upright. 43 years of working wood, 43 years of Canadian winters and prairie summers in that shop outside Red Deer, and I had never once felt the kind of cold that ran through me in that moment. Drop your province or your country in the comments below, friends, and tell me where you are listening from tonight. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you still wakes me in the middle of the night, even now, 2 years later. My name is Walter. I am 67 years old, a retired pipe fitter who spent 31 years on the oil patch up near Fort McMurray before my knees told me it was time to come home. My wife Margaret passed in the autumn of 2021, breast cancer that moved faster than any of us thought possible. After she was gone, the only thing that kept me from drinking myself into the grave was the woodworking shop behind our bungalow, the one I had built with my own 2 hands, the summer we moved to that quarter section outside Red Deer in 1989. 60 acres of good Alberta land, a creek running through the back, and a stand of black walnut my father had planted when he first bought the property after the war. Those trees were my inheritance, and I had been letting a few of them reach maturity, thinking one day I might mill them down and build something truly fine. A dining table, a blanket chest, something my daughter Caroline could pass down to her own children. Caroline was my only child, 38 years old, married 6 years to a man named Trevor who worked in commercial real estate down in Calgary. I had never been entirely easy around my son-in-law. He was the sort who always had an angle, always a new investment opportunity, always something he wanted to pitch at Sunday dinner. Margaret had liked him well enough, or at least she had tried to for Caroline's sake. Me, I kept my counsel. A man does not need to love his daughter's husband. He only needs to tolerate him and keep watch. That Tuesday in late October was one of those gentle prairie days when the leaves on the poplars were still hanging on, the sky that washed out blue you only see in autumn out here. I had driven into town to pick up a new set of chisels at the Home Hardware on the main drag. I had been saving up for them for months, a proper Lee Valley set that cost me the better part of $400, and I was feeling good about myself for once. I had my coffee from Tim Hortons in the truck. I had money in my pocket from my pension check, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I was thinking about a project that might bring me joy instead of just keeping my hands busy. I was standing at the till when I noticed the woman in front of me. She was small, maybe 80 years old, with a kerchief tied under her chin the old country way, the way my own mother used to wear. She had a tin of wood stain, a small package of sandpaper, and a single brass hinge set down on the counter. The young fellow behind the register had told her the total, and she was counting out coins. Quarters, dimes, nickels. Her hands were trembling, and I watched her count that change 3 times before she set it down and looked up at him with a kind of quiet shame I recognized in my bones. "I am $12 short," she said, so softly I almost could not hear her. "I can leave the hinge. I will come back for it next week." Something in me moved before I even thought about it. I stepped forward and set my chisels on the counter beside her little pile. "I will get hers too, son," I said to the cashier. "Ring it all together." The old woman turned to me, and I will tell you the honest truth. The look on her face was not the look of a woman who was grateful. It was the look of a woman who was studying me. Her eyes were pale gray, almost silver, and they held mine for a long moment before she spoke. "You are a kind man," she said. "What is your name?" "Walter," I told her. "Walter Bergstrom, from out on the Glenifer Road." "Bergstrom," she repeated, and she nodded slowly, as though the name meant something to her. "I knew a Bergstrom once, a long time ago." She let me pay. She gathered her little bag of supplies, and she walked with me out into the parking lot, and I remember being surprised at how steady her step was for a woman who looked so fragile. When we reached my truck, she reached out and took hold of my forearm. Her grip was stronger than it had any right to be. She looked up at me, and those pale gray eyes had gone sharp as a chisel's edge. "Walter," she said, and her voice was different now, lower, urgent. "Listen to me carefully. When your daughter's husband comes to your shop this week, and he will come this week, you will let him take whatever he asks for. You will not argue with him. You will not question him. But after he leaves, after his truck has gone down your laneway, do not sweep the sawdust off the workshop floor. Not that night, not until morning. Do you understand me? I stared at her. I thought for a moment she must be one of those old souls who had gone wandering in her mind, the way they sometimes do. But her eyes were clear, clearer than mine, I suspect. Ma'am, I said carefully, I do not know what you are talking about. My son-in-law has not been up to my place in months. He does not have much use for an old man's workshop. She squeezed my arm harder. He will come, before the week is out. You mark my words, Walter Bergstrom. And when he is gone, do not touch that sawdust until the sun is up. Then she let go of my arm, nodded at me once, and walked off toward an old beige Chevrolet parked at the far end of the lot. I stood there with my bag of chisels in my hand, watching her go, and I felt the strangest sensation crawling up my spine, like someone had walked over my grave. I drove home that afternoon, and I did not think much more about it. The old woman was confused, I told myself. She had mistaken me for someone else. Bergstrom is not an uncommon name on the prairies, where half the farmers are Scandinavian by blood. I unloaded my chisels in the shop. I put a pot of stew on the stove, and I watched the Oilers game that night with a beer and my old border collie Duke at my feet. I did not think about her again until Thursday. Thursday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, I heard a truck coming up my laneway. Not the mail truck, which I know by sound. Something heavier. A diesel. I looked out the kitchen window and my heart sank, because pulling up beside my workshop was Trevor's big black Ram 3500, the one with the flatbed trailer hitched behind. And Trevor was already climbing down from the cab, along with another fellow I did not recognize, a heavy-set man in a black hoodie pulled up over his head. I walked out to meet them, and Trevor greeted me with that wide salesman's smile he always wore. "Walter! Hey!" I tried to call, but I could not get through. "Your cell must be off again." "My cell has been on," I said. "But go on. What brings you up here?" Trevor glanced at the other fellow and then back at me. "Listen, Walter, I have a bit of a situation. A buddy of mine down in Calgary is building a custom home up in Canmore, and his architect is looking for some reclaimed black walnut. Live edge. Really high-end stuff. I told him about the trees you have out behind the creek, and he is willing to pay top dollar. I thought, while I was up this way for a showing in Sylvan Lake, I would grab a couple of logs for him. If that is okay with you." I felt the old woman's words at the back of my neck like a cold hand. "You will let him take whatever he asks for. You will not argue with him." "How much is he paying?" I asked, just to hear what Trevor would say. Trevor waved his hand. "We are still working that out. I will cut you in, do not worry about that. Right now, I just want to get him a sample so he can see the quality." A sample. Trevor had a flatbed trailer and a man I did not know, and he called that a sample. But I nodded, and I told him to help himself. I told him the chainsaw was on the hook by the side door, and the straps were in the blue bin. I told him to mind the electric fence at the creek bottom because the bulls were out. Trevor gave me a quick hug, the kind of hug a man gives when he is glad he does not have to work for something. And then he and the other fellow drove the truck down the back track toward the walnut stand. I went into the workshop, and I pretended to work on a bookshelf I had been building, but really I was listening. I heard the chainsaw start up. About 20 minutes later, I heard it run for a long time, and when they finally came back past the house 2 hours later, the flatbed was loaded with 3 big walnut logs, each one the size of a man's torso and probably worth more than Trevor's truck. He waved at me from the cab. I waved back. Then he did something strange. He pulled the truck up, right alongside my workshop, and he and his friend got out. "Walter, do you mind if we grab a bite of something from your fridge before we head back? It is a long drive." "Help yourself," I said. "There is some leftover stew." While they were in the house, I stood in the doorway of my workshop and I watched them through the kitchen window. I saw Trevor open my fridge, take out the stew, and hand it to his buddy. But Trevor himself did not eat. Trevor walked down my hallway toward the spare room where I keep my filing cabinet. The one with all of Margaret's papers, my will, the land title, the bank statements. He was in that room for maybe 4 minutes. Then he came back out to the kitchen, ate a quick bowl of stew, and they left. I watched his tail lights disappear down the laneway. The sun was setting behind the foothills, and the shadows were getting long across my yard. I went into the spare room and I checked the filing cabinet. Nothing seemed out of place, but something felt wrong. Something felt deeply, terribly wrong. And then I remembered the old woman. Do not sweep the sawdust. I walked out to the workshop and I turned on the overhead lights. The floor was covered in a fresh layer of fine sawdust from the afternoon's work, mine, and I now realized whatever Trevor had been doing in there while his friend was in the house. I had not even noticed him slip into the shop. I looked around carefully, and at first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just my bench, my tools, my half-finished bookshelf. A pile of offcuts in the corner. The sawdust on the floor, undisturbed by my feet because I had stayed in the doorway. I wanted so badly to sweep. 40 years of habit. A clean shop is a safe shop, my father always said. But the old woman's voice was in my ear, and so I turned off the light. I locked the door, and I went into the house. I did not sleep that night. Duke lay at the foot of my bed, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind coming down off the foothills, and I tried to understand what I was feeling. Around 3 in the morning I got up and I made myself a cup of coffee and I sat at the kitchen table watching the clock. When the first gray light came up over the eastern horizon, I pulled on my work boots and my parka, and I walked out to the shop with a flashlight in my hand. I opened the door slowly, carefully. I stepped inside and I shone the beam down at the floor, and there, pressed into the fresh sawdust, were footprints. 2 sets. One of them was Trevor's work boots, I could tell by the Vibram pattern. The other was smaller, narrower, a running shoe of some kind. The footprints led from the side door, around the back of my workbench, over to the corner where I kept an old steamer trunk that had belonged to my grandfather. The trunk had been shoved a few inches out of place. I could see the clean rectangle on the concrete where it had sat for years. I opened the trunk with hands that were starting to shake. Inside, beneath the old horse blankets my grandfather had kept in there, was a black duffel bag I had never seen before in my life. I unzipped it slowly. Inside that bag were 4 bricks of what looked to me like compressed white powder, each one wrapped in plastic and duct tape. Along with them was a scale, a box of small Ziploc baggies, and an envelope stuffed with Canadian $100 bills, maybe $20,000? At a glance. I sat down on the concrete floor of my workshop, and I put my head in my hands. I understood everything now, everything. Trevor was going to call the RCMP. Or worse, he was going to tell Caroline that her father had been keeping terrible secrets, that the old man was slipping in his mind, that he needed to be declared incompetent and put into a home. Either way, the land would end up in Trevor's hands. 60 acres outside Red Deer, worth close to $2 million with the commercial corridor pushing north out of town. The black walnut stand alone was worth a fortune, and he had already begun stripping that. But the real prize was the land itself, and the easiest way to get it was to have the old man locked up, whether in a prison or a care home. But I had not swept the floor. The footprints were there, his and someone else's, probably the fellow in the hoodie. The trunk had been moved, and a man who was secretly dealing drugs would hardly let a stranger help him hide his stash in a footprint-laden floor. A man would hide his own stash, alone, in secret. I took out my phone and I photographed everything. The footprints, the duffel bag, the contents, the trunk. I took pictures of the fresh saw marks where Trevor had cut my walnut, the way the cuts were made hastily, wastefully, the way a man cuts when he does not own the trees and does not care about them. I went into the spare room and I checked the filing cabinet again, carefully this time, and I found what I had missed the night before. My will, the one Margaret and I had made together in 2015, had been replaced. Someone had taken the original and put a new one in its place. The new one left everything to Trevor and Caroline jointly, and specifically named Trevor as the executor and the trustee of any estate. My own signature was forged on the bottom, a reasonable forgery, but not a perfect one. I understood then that this had been planned for a long time. Months, maybe longer. He had been waiting for the right moment. He had waited until Margaret was gone, until I was isolated and grieving and alone with my grief. He had been patient. I drove into Red Deer that morning. I did not go to the RCMP yet. I went first to my lawyer, Gordon McPherson, a fellow I had known since we were boys together at the old Lindsay Thurber High School. Gordon had drawn up my original will. He took one look at the forged document and he shook his head. He told me to sit tight, to say nothing to anyone, and to let him make some phone calls. While I was waiting in his office, I thought about the old woman at the hardware store. Something was nagging at me. I took out my phone and I called Gordon's receptionist, and I asked her if she could look up a name for me. Any Bergstroms in the Red Deer area. Older records. Going back to the 70s or 80s. She came back 20 minutes later with a single name. Ingrid Bergstrom, my grandfather's younger sister. She had married a man named Halverson and moved up to Rocky Mountain House in 1958. I had never met her. My father had had a falling out with her over something to do with the homestead before I was born, and the two branches of the family had never spoken again. I drove out to Rocky Mountain House that afternoon. I found her in a little bungalow on the edge of town, and when she opened the door, those pale gray eyes met mine, and she nodded as though she had been expecting me. "Come in, Walter," she said. "I will put the kettle on." Over tea at her kitchen table, Ingrid told me the story. In 1974, her own son, a young man named Eric, had come home from working the rigs down in Texas. He had been gone for 3 years and had come back with a pretty American wife and a head full of schemes. Eric had convinced Ingrid and her husband to sign over their farm for what he called tax planning. Within 6 months, Eric and his wife had sold the land, left Ingrid and her husband with nothing, and moved back to Texas. Ingrid's husband died of a heart attack the following winter, in a rented suite above a hardware store in town. Ingrid had spent every day of the last 50 years watching for the same thing to happen to someone else. "I saw Trevor at the hardware store on Tuesday morning," she told me. "An hour before you came in, he was buying a brick of rat poison and a roll of duct tape and a bag of cable ties. A man does not buy those things for home repairs, Walter. A man buys those things for other purposes. And when I heard him ask the cashier about your place, about whether anyone had seen old Bergstrom in town lately, I followed him out to the parking lot and I memorized his license plate. I looked up your name in the phone book that afternoon. I had been planning to come out to your place Wednesday morning. But then there you were, standing behind me in the till, paying for my stain and my hinge, and I thought the good Lord had put you in my path for a reason." She reached across the table and she took my hand in both of hers. Her hands were soft and thin as tissue paper. I could not save my own husband. I could not save my own farm, but I could save yours. I could at least do that much. I sat at her kitchen table and I cried. The first real cry I had cried since Margaret's funeral. I went to the RCMP detachment that evening. I gave them the photographs. I gave them the duffel bag. I gave them the forged will. They told me to go home and to act normal, to say nothing to Caroline, to let them do their work. It took them 11 days. On the 12th day, the RCMP arrested Trevor outside his office in Calgary. They found the rest of his operation in a storage unit in northeast Calgary. Cocaine mostly, with some fentanyl mixed in, which is the part that still keeps me up at night, because that is the stuff that is killing our young people across this whole country. Trevor was charged with trafficking, forgery, fraud, and attempted murder. The attempted murder charge came from a journal they found on his laptop, in which he had detailed a plan to poison me over the Christmas holidays and make it look like a heart attack. His friend in the hoodie, a man named Dale Rocha, was picked up a day later at the border trying to cross into Montana. Caroline came out to the farm the day after the arrest. She was wrecked. 29 weeks pregnant with her first child, my grandson, and her husband was in custody, and her whole life was in ruins. She sat at my kitchen table and she wept, and I held her the way I had held her when she was a little girl, and I told her it would be all right. I told her she would come and live with me until the baby was born, and that was what she did. My grandson was born in January of that year. We named him Oscar, after my father. He is 2 years old now, and he toddles out to the workshop with me every afternoon, and he sits on a little stool I built him, and he watches me plane the black walnut boards I milled from the 3 logs the RCMP returned to me after the trial. I am building him a blanket chest. I am carving his name into the lid. Caroline filed for divorce. Trevor took a plea deal, and will not be out until Oscar is almost ready for university. Caroline and I do not talk about him much. Some things you have to leave behind in order to go forward. Ingrid passed away last summer peacefully in her sleep. She left me a letter that Gordon delivered after the funeral. In the letter, she told me that seeing Oscar in my arms at her 90th birthday party was the happiest day of her life since her husband's death. She said that God is slow but not blind, and that sometimes he uses an old woman with $12 of missing change to answer a prayer that someone did not even know they were praying. I have thought about that often over these last 2 years. I have thought about how a small act of kindness, a $44 bag of wood stain and a brass hinge, saved my land, my life, and my daughter's future. I have thought about how I almost did not say anything to Ingrid in that hardware store, how I almost just paid for my own chisels and walked out and minded my own business, the way a Canadian is so often taught to do. How close I came to losing everything, not because I did wrong, but because I almost did not do the small right thing. I want to leave you with this, friends. Whatever province you are listening from tonight, whatever country, whatever age you are, whatever troubles you are carrying, be kind to the stranger in front of you, in line. You do not know what they have been watching for. You do not know what they are trying to warn you about. You do not know whose grandfather, whose daughter, whose unborn grandchild might be saved because you opened your wallet for $12 worth of nails and hinges. And if someone ever grips your arm and whispers something that does not make any sense, something about sawdust or leaves or the sound your own truck makes in the laneway, you listen to them. You listen to them hard. Because out here on the Canadian prairies, the wind carries more than just the cold. It carries warnings, if you know how to hear them. And the good Lord still uses ordinary people, standing in ordinary lines at ordinary hardware stores, to do extraordinary things. Oscar is calling me from the back porch. He wants to come out and see what his grandfather is building. I will set down my phone now and I will go to him, and I will lift him up onto his little stool, and I will show him the grain of the walnut and how it caught the light this morning. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone you love, and tell me in the comments below where you are listening from and whether anyone has ever whispered a warning in your ear that you are grateful you listened to. I read every comment, and I will be here waiting for yours. God bless you, and good night from Red Deer, Alberta.